I tell you what,
It's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And today we're going to talk to you about the Addams Family, which, as I think everyone knows, started off as some amusing cartoon drawings by cartoonist Charles Addams, who was drawing cartoons for the New Yorker famously, and probably some other things in like the 50s and the 60s, and he was drawing little scenes with this kind of eldritch, macabre, almost evil family that spoke to people and appealed to the public imagination. And from that, the 1960s TV series was developed. Do you remember what years?
Yes, it's 64 to 66. 2 seasons.
And in the 70s, I think there was a Hanna-Barbera cartoon of it. I think there was also a new cartoon in the 90s when the movies were being released. And since then, there's been a musical, there's been kind of other movies and series that I've glimpsed on YouTube and thought, oh, what a load of rubbish. So we're going to talk to you about the things that we have watched and I've particularly enjoyed, the 60s TV series and the 2 90s movies. And I'm going to mention some bits of a couple of the cartoons I can remember too, actually. And I think once or twice I'm also going to mention the TV series called The New Addams Family or something like that, because I've got a couple of things relevant to a couple of things I want to say. When they were developing the TV series, they were doing so in order to rival the Munsters. And this is a story I heard someone telling in a special feature on one of the DVDs. Somebody came along pitching the idea for the Addams Family. It was rejected. Another channel heard about it and said, oh, that sounds pretty good, but instead of paying this guy to make his series, let's make up our own, which is the same sort of thing. And they made up the Munsters. And if you like the Addams Family, as I have, you might have experienced people saying, oh, if you like that, you'll love the Munsters. Watch the Munsters, it's really good. And then maybe you've watched an episode of the Munsters and thought, this is crap. Because it actually was. The humour is pretty pathetic. And what's the point you always make about the Munsters?
Having the characters as actual monsters is a lot less subtle than having them as people who are mysterious, spooky and macabre.
Yes, and it's true. And then I think I say something like, that wouldn't matter so much, would it, if the show was any good? In itself, it's not a bad thing, but I think it is trying to cover up for the inferior writing and humour and possibly acting. I don't know, it's hard to tell because the material itself isn't as good. I think Herman Munster is quite famous and a known name, isn't he, as a sort of Frankenstein's monster. So the Munsters is kind of in the soup as well as the Addams Family, and I think I read that when they were first shown, the Munsters won the ratings war, which is a shame because it's vastly inferior. I don't think we're going to mention the Munsters again, but it is worth mentioning if you're going to talk about the Addams Family, and in fact they are mentioned. I can't remember how much, but there's a picture of them and some writing about them in this book that I bought called The Addams Chronicles. And that is written by a person called Steve Cox, not very well. It reminds me very much of fan websites that are not well written. Some fan websites are well written, but this Steve Cox person reminds me of ones who are not, and he is extremely personal. This book is full of very personal comments about how attractive the women look, and things about who's bald, who's a dwarf or midget is the word he likes, who was rather chubby as a child and that kind of thing. And he's on the commentaries on the DVD as well, being very rude to Felix Siller, who played Cousin It, who we'll talk about, and about Jackie Coogan, who played Uncle Fester. So I don't recommend this book kind of generally, but what it has got in it that's very interesting is, certain information that's written however badly, but it's also got quite a lot of Charles Addams's original cartoon drawings. and his notes that he wrote about how he envisioned the characters behaving, which I believe he only wrote because he was asked for them when they were developing the TV series. I don't think he would have written them for any other reason. I may be wrong. They didn't use everything. For example, he says that Lurch, the butler, doesn't ever speak, which is not something that they went with in the TV show. And I think we'll talk more about those sorts of things as we talk about the characters individually. And I may also refer to one or two of the cartoon drawings he did that I can remember that are relevant to what we're going to say. Another interesting thing about when they were developing the sitcom that I heard about the process, I heard this on Reddit, I think, on a special feature, was that they were thinking, how can we take these cartoons of people doing really quite horrible, sadistic, evil things and make it into a family sitcom? And the example that they gave is the cartoon that Charles Addams drew of, I think, Lurch, Grandmama, Morticia, and Gomez pouring boiling oil onto carol singers. And they were saying, when you're making TV, you have to think about the next step. When you're drawing a cartoon, you don't think about the next step, and it's funny because it's static. I remember seeing another picture by Charles Addams of a guy skiing and looking back at this woman who's skiing, and her ski tracks go around both sides of a tree. And he's looking at her like, whoa, how does she do that? And you can't adapt that for television, can't you? Because you can't show the build-up to it. It's a static moment, like these Addams Family scenes. This is what they were explaining to me. It was very interesting. So rather than have the family do evil things, they develop the characters into very nice, very amicable, friendly people who don't do evil things or want to hurt anybody at all, but who are just a bit weird and who like dark and spooky things, and they want ghosts and pets like lions and spiders and animals that people traditionally don't like. They do also like pain. They enjoy relaxing on the torture equipment, and if they ever do hurt anyone or freak anyone out, it's because they sort of assume that they like it, just like they do. But another thing that they were telling me was that they wanted to present them as a very functional family, very happy, all loving each other, and they were juxtaposing that with more, in a sense, traditional people, particularly couples who live what is perceived as a normal, healthy life, but they hate each other. And it's true, whenever there's another married couple on the Addams Family, they do hate each other. So the values and ideology that they've presented there is that the best thing is to be yourself and not worry about being different as long as you're happy, and the people who conform, or conformists, probably aren't as happy as the people who feel free to express themselves.
Is it fair to say that most of the humour on the Addams Family sitcom revolves around people meeting the Addams Family, coming into their home, coming into their lives, and being freaked out by them? The Addams Family, in order to realising that people are going to be freaked out by their mysterious and spooky and kooky ways.
Yes, I suppose that is most of the humour.
Certainly when you were watching the repeats on BBC Two in the mornings in the 90s, it struck me how that usually was the case. They've got their insurance broker freaking him out. They take in this beatnik, and he gets to like them, and they freak out his stuffy old father, quite by accident, of course.
Yes, that's right. I found it channel hopping through all 4 channels one morning, didn't I? It must have been the holidays and I was bored and had nothing to do and wondered what was on television. I thought, oh, watch this, it looks interesting. And thinking about it, probably the reason they were showing it is that these movies were in the pipeline, and maybe BBC Two got a little bit of money from whoever was making the movies to air the Addams Family. I'm not sure, but it certainly worked on me. It made me very much interested in the Addams Family and want to go and see the movies. What I want to do now is talk about the TV sitcom and the 90s movies character by character, and by doing so I think we'll probably say everything we want to about the plot and the actors as well as the characters themselves. Let's start with Thing, who is most definitely worth mentioning. And I can't remember if it's in my book, I think it is. Anyway, somewhere I've seen a picture by Charles Addams which has got a long, long, long arm with an elbow and everything coming out of the box and a hand on the end. And that is his drawing, or perhaps one of his drawings, of Thing. And then in the 60s sitcom, they had boxes around the set and places for usually Ted Cassidy to crawl into and stick his hand up through them to be Thing, and it never got as far as the elbow. Sometimes we saw quite a lot of his forearm.
Like when he's doing things like arm wrestling with Gomez, for example.
Yes, absolutely. And surely the reason they wanted Ted Cassidy to be Thing was that he had the biggest hand, and certainly it gives him a presence, makes him very noticeable in the scenes. When Ted Cassidy is playing his other character, Lurch, somebody who works behind the cameras is Thing, they were telling me. They did tell me his name, but I can't remember it. And I think I worked that out before anyone told me. I thought, oh, Thing looks smaller in this scene. Oh, that's not the big hand they usually have. And then I realised, or perhaps someone in the family suggested, that that was because it was Ted Cassidy's hand and he was busy playing Lurch. But the thing to say about Thing is that for the 90s movies, they took him out of his box and had him as a roaming hand, doing very much the same sorts of things, helping out the family, being a friend to them. But anyone who knows anything, or, who writes this book or speaks on these DVDs, says that was a really bad decision because it takes away the mystery of what is Thing. And oh look, they're doing this CG effect just because they can, and I think that's absolutely correct of everyone to say that, and it's very true. What I would like to add, though, is I think to some extent, maybe just one or two of the writers, if not all of them, of the sitcom were in some way responsible for that, because they would often imply that Thing was only a hand. People who like to talk about the mystery and where's it coming from and what is it, so you can imagine all kinds of things and monsters and anything that the hand could be coming off, and maybe it's more than one hand, maybe it is one hand and it has like a network all over the house and it can just pop up anywhere, or maybe it's not. But often they would imply that it is one hand, like they pick up his box and carry it, or they would say that he was going to travel with them in the glove compartment. And there's one where Thing has staged his own kidnapping because he feels unappreciated, and some ordinary person, I can't remember who or why, but he's going to take the ransom to the rendezvous point, and he's describing what he sees as just a hand coming to get the money. So I can see why someone might have got the impression that they wanted the character to be a hand, and if they could have done in the 60s, maybe they would have gone to greater lengths to show that it was just a hand. So a series of mistakes there, I think.
I'm always reminded of Jeff Goldblum, one of his many good quotes from Jurassic Park. They were thinking about what they could do to make Thing into a free roaming hand, and consider that perhaps they shouldn't do it. And definitely they shouldn't have done it. Ironically, Christopher Hart, who played Thing in the 90s movies, Addams Family Values, is one of two returning cast members in the kind of flop TV movie from 1999, Addams Family Reunion, which we really know nothing about, but it had Tim Curry as Gomez, which is possibly quite interesting and might work very well or not. Perhaps we might see it one day.
It doesn't sound quite right to me, I have to say, but I haven't seen it.
But if you're going to have two returning cast members, and one of them's Thing, how will anyone ever notice? Well, doubtless they didn't. But Lurch was the same as well.
This is one of the times when I want to mention the new Addams Family, which I think is what it's called, because I'm fairly sure Thing was free roaming in that as well. I've seen the opening title sequence and it's got him like scuttling about like a spider, so no one's ever considered going back to what Thing ought to be, which is injudicious of everybody. Another thing they did with Thing in the TV series was to give him a girlfriend, Lady Fingers, and of course Lady Fingers is something that you do baking with as well, isn't it? So it was a pun, and that was the hand of Carolyn Jones, who played Morticia, they told me. So let's talk about the other person who isn't one of the big seven, the seven people who stand there clicking in the opening titles. And that's Cousin It, played by Felix Siller in the TV series, who I mentioned as one of the people that this Steve Cox person was very, very rude about. And he's on the commentaries with Steve Cox, doing a very good job of keeping his cool when Steve Cox is being rude to him. And one thing they say, and it staggers the cast members who are with Steve Cox, is that Charles Addams never drew a Cousin It. He's someone that they made up for the TV show. And he's become, I was going to say iconic, I don't know if that's too strong a word, but someone that one has heard of if one knows anything about the Addams Family and can visualise, who's just loads of hair. And on his first appearance in the 60s sitcom, he's got a very elaborate, huge wig and hair skirt kind of set made out of human hair, and they were telling me that that was very expensive, and the next time you see him, he's got a rather cruder looking horsehair costume, and I generally think of him as having on a hat and a pair of sunglasses, but that's something that they only introduced sort of about halfway through the series and sometimes, and he comes to visit the family and he talks funny. It's like which I think people found very amusing in the 60s, and he's one of the aspects of Addams Family life that ordinary people encounter and get freaked out.
He has his own room in the house eventually in the TV series, doesn't he?
Yes, just to come and stay in sometimes, and it's a very funny scene where everyone's crowding into this room which is made to scale with Felix Siller, so everything's kind of half size, and Morticia comes in to talk to him, Gomez comes in, I think Lurch comes in at one point, and he's over 7 feet tall, or is that an exaggeration?
Nearly 7 feet tall, I think.
Quite a lot taller than the room would like people to be. And what happens with Cousin It? He has elocution lessons at one point, so he stops doing his...
I found that rather disappointing when you were watching the BBC Two repeats, that he could actually be taught to speak properly. I thought that spoiled him.
I don't know what I thought. I mean, he's supposed to be a human being, so I don't know. Of course, it ends up with him going back to his own unique way of talking. He becomes an actor and does his posh speaking, and then someone tells him he looks like a freak or something, and he gets cross and starts having a go at them and then realises that that wasn't who he was after all. Is it the same episode or a different one? I think it's a different one where he's having aptitude tests, and this guy telling him to put the wood in the holes and all that kind of thing, which you always get in aptitude tests in sitcoms. And a bit of 60s humour we couldn't have now, as if everyone is trying to discourage him from being a stewardess. Of course, now nothing at all would stop him from being a flight attendant if he wanted to.
Felix Siller is one of the few actors from the 60s one still alive at the time of this podcast, as far as we could tell from Wikipedia, anyway.
And anyway, he was robust enough to do those commentaries, and he said the most interesting things, because the other two actors played two children, tell you about them very soon, and couldn't really remember very much. Ken Weatherwax in particular didn't seem to want to talk to Steve Cox, and I don't blame him after having read what he said about him in his book. In the movies, Cousin It has no hat and no sunglasses, which I think surprised and possibly slightly disappointed me when I saw it in the cinema. I hadn't really realised that he sometimes looked that way in the sitcom, because I hadn't seen the early episodes. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the person who was wearing the giant wig. I don't think he had any kind of dwarfism from looking at him. He's not fantastically tall, but he's not fantastically short either. I think he's just a fairly short man, and he comes along to see the Addamses, and he does his funny speaking, and he ends up going off with and marrying. Are they married by the end of the first film?
Yeah.
This character called Margaret, who is the wife of the person, or one of the people, who are trying to scam the Addams family, and she's becoming jaded with her marriage, and then falls in love with Cousin It, and becomes very much an Addams herself. And in the second movie, we see her with Cousin It, and they've had a baby as well. What? Who's like a miniature Cousin It with a little dumb in his mouth, and it's really cute, and she really quite likes all the Addams stuff that initially freaked her out when she went to see them. So some cameos from cousin-it in the film, and Charles Addams never drew a cousin-it. I can't visualise him being in either of the cartoon series either, although if he was in the second one, that would be because of the films, wouldn't it? So they didn't have to include him. I don't think anyone would have minded too much, except that he was so memorable from the TV series, and it would be a good idea. Now, I've mentioned Lurch a couple of times, so let's talk about him. He was played, as I said, by Ted Cassidy in the sitcom, who was not over 7 feet tall, but he was very, very tall, and I think he was one of the things, aspects that really struck me when I found it on BBC Two as a child, and he looks like a kind of Frankenstein monster, and he's not a family member, he is the butler. And he does lurch about. His catchphrase, "you rag," is so iconic that it's in that kind of rap that they had at the end of the movie. And they've got bells just wherever they need them in the house that are like hangman's nooses. They pull them and the whole house shakes and makes the most ridiculous loud noise, and if someone's there they're like falling over and freaking out, and then Lurch just appears. He's been nowhere and he's just right there saying rang, which is visually very funny. Generally the person who's there has seen him because he's opened the door, and they completely freak out when he opens the door, of course, and they manage to stutter out who they are and why they're there. He says, "Follow me." It's not a very good Lurch impression because I can't do a very, very deep voice like Ted Cassidy, but it's brilliant. It's just so way down in his stomach. The voice is fantastic, and certainly one of the recurring characters gets used to him, of course. About the third or fourth time Lurch opens the door, he just says, "I'm here to pick up the things at the charity auction," just like he's seeing any normal butler. And he tells his wife, I think, when she's freaked out by him, he's actually a nice fella. She says, "He looks like parts of 3 nice fellas." Which is the kind of humour they used to do. So he normally says, "You rang and follow me," and he makes noises, doesn't he, to express how he's feeling. They tell him something's gone wrong, he's like, "Ugh." And then there are some episodes where he has quite a lot of lines. There are a couple of episodes about Lurch, like the classic, the butler pretends to be the master of the house, and the whole family is supporting him, and this is to impress his mother, I seem to remember, who's a really tiny woman, and it's quite visually comical when he's going to hug her. She's got her arms around his waist, and he's trying to fling his arms around her, and they're just like above her head, and he's only hugging himself. And he's got the support of the whole family and pretending to be the master of the house, and Gomez is going to pretend to be the butler. The bit I remember is where the phone's ringing, and Gomez is saying, "I'm going to answer it, okay, Lurch?" And Lurch is on the sofa, he's like, "Yeah, okay." And Gomez gets near the phone, and then suddenly Lurch leaps up and barges him out of the way and picks up the phone because he can't not answer the phone. And there's this whole thing where he can't not be the butler, but then of course eventually he can, and it gets to the stage where he kind of forgets and starts sacking Gomez and Morticia, who are pretending to be servants, the kind of thing. And another very memorable Lurch ep is the one where he is learning to dance for the butler's ball. I always used to enjoy that one when I was younger. There are some episodes that aren't very funny when you're younger, and some where you absolutely get why it's funny. And this dance teacher woman comes, instructress they call her, which I don't think we would have now. It's very gender specific, and she keeps fainting, and then it turns out she's not fainting because she's scared of Lurch. She says, "I always faint when I meet new people." And then she starts trying to teach him to dance, and he's completely freaked out by this, and he faints. And I always used to find that very funny when I was younger, because he doesn't look like the kind of person who would be intimidated by a dance teacher.
Lurch is actually very vulnerable and sweet underneath it all, which is nice when we get to see that. And I do think his sparing use of dialogue really adds to the character quite a lot, and I was disappointed seeing things like the movies, cartoons where he didn't speak at all. That's a mistake. It takes something away, or having him speak a little bit like Mr. Bean adds a lot to the character. We mentioned Ted Cassidy for all his great work on the Incredible Hulk TV series, of course.
I was thinking when we last watched the movies, which was very recently, of course, well, I suppose there's enough going on. It doesn't matter so much that Lurch doesn't speak. They don't really need him to say anything to add to the plot, so it's okay.
I've always thought he gets a bit lost in those movies.
Well, I think he does serve more as a background character, I suppose, doesn't he?
Yeah.
But they've gone back to Charles Addams's notes there, which isn't a bad excuse if they want one, is it? So yes, it's definitely a very, very good thing indeed for Ted Cassidy as Lurch to speak. And I don't mind so much in the films. It does make him more of a background character, but there's quite a lot going on, so maybe he works okay as a background character.
And he's called Carol Struchen, or something like that, not sure exactly how it's pronounced, in the 90s movies. And as I mentioned as well, 1999, Addams Family Reunion. He's the other returning cast member as well as Thing. And he's Dutch, I just looked up and found out, which is why he's called something that we can't really know how to pronounce off the top of our heads in English.
And when you read about him, you find out he's quite tall, don't you? But he doesn't appear that tall in the film, certainly compared to Ted Cassidy. I think Raul Julia, who plays Gomez, is quite tall as well, and makes Lurch appear a bit less tall. Because I do remember when I was little looking at him and thinking, Ted Cassidy's way better, he's so much bigger. But Carol was apparently chosen partly because he is tall. An interesting thing is that Lurch used to play the harpsichord a lot in the 60s one, and they were telling me all sorts of things about the harpsichord, about how the children couldn't remember if it was a real harpsichord or a prop, and then someone points out, well, it has to be a prop because thing pops up through the top of it. And they may even explain to me the difference between a piano and a harpsichord being plucked and a piano being beaten, percussion. But for the films, he does a similar thing, but he plays an organ, like in the opening sequence of Count Duckula that we were talking about. It's much more kind of atmospheric and eerie feeling, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the whole atmosphere of the films, it's still funny, it's still comedy, but it is a lot darker. So that's one of the reasons they've done that, the kind of look and the sound of the organ adds to that. Which reminds me, I wanted to say something else about that pouring boiling oil cartoon. They kind of introduced the idea that, well, this is a bit darker than the TV series you're used to, by opening up with some carol singers and then panning up to the top of the house, and you get a recreation of that cartoon of Grandmama Lurch, Gomez and Morticia pouring this boiling oil onto the carolers, and you don't have to see the next step, because it's just the beginning and it cuts to something else and it's the music and everything. Following the carol, it's that Carol of the Bells thing, which is very annoying actually. It goes into or a version of the theme tune from the 60s, with the clicking, the da-da-da-da stuff, which makes people who watched it in the 60s, even more than people who've been watching it recently probably, go, oh yes, that's the Addams Family, and they make it sound really very sinister. But as I was saying, they probably assume that carol singers like having boiling oil poured on them because they would enjoy it themselves. Which reminds me of one of the Charles Addams cartoons I have seen, which is Uncle Fester, who I might leave till last, which is very important, standing in a shower, and there's just like all this steam and it's covering up his lower half, of course, and he's got this temperature gauge on the shower, and I think it says cold, hot, very hot, scalding, and he's turning it up to scalding, which is some evidence, if not the only evidence in the cartoons, that the Addams Family like pain. So I think that's quite interesting to think about when they're on their torture rack or whatever. Another thing just generally, I thought of this now, just generally about the Addamses, is that they have a degree of invulnerability, don't they?
That's right.
Which is very interesting. They electrocute each other in the electric chair. Uncle Fester is almost killed, attempted to be murdered a couple of times in the second movie. And they always survive. So they like pain, they like doing things that would be fatal to the rest of us. And to some extent, they have kind of superpowers, don't they? Uncle Fester being a source of electricity, and Morticia in the TV series lights candles with her fingers. So, not a million miles away from the monsters in that respect. Perhaps they're not completely human. Which brings us quite nicely onto Grandmama, who is presented as a kind of witch. So she's a human, but she's generally doing some kind of potion making at some stage in all her incarnations. Charles Addams drew her as Granny Frump, Morticia's mother. And they didn't go with that in the TV series. She is Mrs. Addams Sr., Gomez's mother, the kind of previous mistress of the house, and we can see her ringing Lurch's bell in the flashback one where Morticia isn't there yet and she's about to come and decide to marry Gomez. And she was played by Blossom Rock, which is a very interesting name. And this book I keep going on about it. Oh, yes, that's a real name, but I think it's a selection from a lot of middle names and husbands' names that she had. And Grandmama was a character that you would see a bit less often than most of the others in the TV series, with the possible and probable exceptions of the children who weren't in as many episodes as most of the adults because of hours and stuff. And she had this kind of wild hag appearance. She'd be, as I say, doing potions. There was mention of her wrestling a crocodile a lot of the time. So like, oh, where's Mama? She's just wrestling with the crocodile and that kind of thing. And I'm struggling to think of any episodes that were actually about her. And I think that's because there weren't any. Whilst I don't wish to be rude, I think she did capture my imagination less than all the other characters when I was watching it as a child. But she certainly does what she needs to do, being this kind of wild, eccentric old hag witch kind of character. Oh, there's one where she gets put in prison, but I don't remember why. But that's the one where they're doing the court case, which has got that very funny line. Gomez has got this ridiculous approximation of a barrister's wig on, and he's saying that he's going to defend Mama and stuff, and then he goes, no matter what the verdict, I will appeal. He's just been talking nonsense anyway, and you're like, well, what's the point then?
And he is a qualified lawyer, as it turns out at many points in the TV series, but that's how he does his lawyering, if and when he ever does it, not in the way other lawyers would.
That's what's so great about the Addams Family. I was talking about that rap. They do what they want to do, say what they want to say, live how they want to live, play how they want to play, and that's their appeal, really, isn't it? We all like to do that. Going back to this Granny Frump thing, she, or that name, was given to another character, or another version of the character, Morticia's mother, in the TV series, played by Margaret Hamilton, and you recognise her voice right away if you're familiar with the Wizard of Oz. She comes in and just starts playing Miss Gulch, kind of bossy and overbearing, telling everyone they have to marry Gomez or not marry Gomez or whatever, because that's why she's there. She's brought Ophelia, her older daughter, to marry Gomez, and Morticia's there too, and she falls in love with Gomez, and they end up marrying each other. But then she's in it a couple of other times, isn't she? Just visiting. I can't really remember what she does, but the bit I do remember is where she goes and greets Uncle Fester, and we've at that point worked out, well, he's got to be her brother. And perhaps I'll explain why if I remember when we talk about Uncle Fester. She's saying, hello, Fester, and he says, oh, hi, Granny. And we're like, oh, he called his sister Granny. And then in the films, they again go back to Charles Addams' notes, and along with Lurch Doesn't Speak, they get Granny Frump, Morticia's mother, although I don't think the name is mentioned, is it?
No.
But Morticia's calling her Mama, and she's interacting more with Morticia, and it's very obvious she's her mother. And I think Gomez's parents are in the graveyard, buried, aren't they?
Yes, they're mentioned a couple of times in both films. Mother and Father Addams, who are dead and in the graveyard, yes.
And in the first film, she's played by Judith Malina, or Melina, I don't know how to pronounce that one. And she does actually make me laugh at one point where they're giving away this finger trap thing, one of their oddities around the house, and Margaret is saying, oh, Morticia, it must be worth a fortune. And Grandmama turns around and goes, let's keep it. I think that's quite amusing when she says it. Other than that, I don't really retain much of what she does in the film.
There's this line that she delivers, it's kind of a punchline that I always found quite memorable, where Morticia is going, poisonous, stab us, torture us, kill us, we'll come back for more, and you know why? And Grandmama goes, because we like it. Just kind of summing up what we kind of know about the characters but never gets said explicitly. It's always a gamble lines like that, isn't it? Spelling these things out as a joke, but I think it works quite well in that bit of the film, and obviously Judith said the punchline rather well to make it work. And the real reason Morticia says is because we're Addamses, which is kind of like because we like it, it's very much the same thing.
So she doesn't have a massive role in the film as Grandmama, and I think a lot of that is to do with how she was one of the least used and possibly one of the least memorable characters in the series. I think they've used the series a lot to influence the directions that they took the characters in, except maybe Lurch. they figured they didn't have a lot to do with him or want to do a lot with him, so looked more back to Charles's notes. Then, for whatever reason, the part was recast for Addams Family Values. Maybe they didn't like Judith, even though we liked those couple of lines she did. Maybe she was busy. Sometimes you find out people are in a play when they can't be in a film or on television. But she was recast and played by Carol Kane, and she does more memorable, anyway, kind of witchy stuff, doesn't she?
I often wonder, well, when we watch the movies anyway, if they thought, oh, we need someone who's going to be really, really good at playing the witchy character, to carry the skull around and hex Debbie and things like that. Judith not good enough.
I can imagine her doing that sort of thing quite well, personally, but maybe she did a screen test of it and it was rubbish. I mean, we just don't know, do we?
I always thought it was a little disappointing that one of them was different in Addams Family Values, seemingly for no reason.
I always kind of thought she must have died because she was old, but no, that's not it. She didn't die until a few years ago.
Yes, we discovered, researching this, she was only in her 60s, being Grandmama in the Addams Family movie, Judith Malina, and she died in 2015. But also, it turns out, Carol Kane was only in her 40s with a lot of makeup and wig and things. She's only 66 now in 2018. So perhaps she's a specialist at playing old witchy characters, even when she wasn't old herself.
I do remember thinking she looked more made up than the original Grandmama. But that's what she does in the film anyway. Hex Debbie, we'll tell you a bit about later. She's looking things up in this kind of witchy book when the baby is ill. It's like a sort of demonic possession, but subverted. He looks angelic. It's where the film goes a bit weird at that stage and tails off a bit towards the end. But anyway, witchy stuff in a supporting role is what she does in that movie. And it's quite interesting that Charles Addams imagined one character, and then in the sitcom they made her into two characters. One who would fulfill that role and another one who would be Granny Frump and Morticia's mother, and then they brought them back into the same character for the movies. Next, let's talk about the children, and let's start with Pugsley. I just mentioned the baby, who was a new baby for Addams Family Values at the end of the Addams Family movie. Morticia's knitting a baby grow, or romper suit as they would probably call it, with 3 legs. Actually, because it's human, it's not going to have 3 legs, but it's quite funny anyway that that's what she's knitting for the baby.
It's homage to the TV series, isn't it, where she tries to make those paper dollies in a row all the time, and the middle one always has 3 legs.
Yes, or something else wrong with it sometimes happens. I think it starts with 3 legs, and it's usually 3 legs, and some other things. But anyway, yes, it's certainly that. And also to her knitting that she's always doing. And it's funny as well to think that she might have a baby and would like to have a baby with 3 legs. But the reason I say this when I said I was going to talk about Pugsley is that the baby's name is Pubert, and Charles Addams wanted the boy, who he drew, and they didn't get names till they were being spread on television, I don't think. He wanted him to be called Pubert, but apparently that was unacceptable to people in the 60s, as somebody put it, perhaps Steve Cox, because it sounds like pubes. So they had to go with Pugsley, which actually I think is a funnier name when Gomez is saying it for jokes, like Matt Groening explains that Marge is funnier than Margaret when it's being yelled by Homer. I think Pugsley is funnier for kind of punchlines than Pubert, so perhaps that works out best. In any adaptations where there's colour, which is pretty much everything except the 60s TV show, Pugsley's stripes on his t-shirt are green and white, so I always imagined that that was what they were in the 60s, and this is just absolutely useless information. There are colour photos, kind of publicity photos of the cast, and you can see that his stripes are red, which I never would have imagined, so that blew me away the first time I saw it. And he was played by Ken Weatherwax.
Perhaps they chose the red because it gave the nicest sort of darker look on the black and white telly, a bit like the chocolate sauce for blood in Psycho.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes I think about how the first series of I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched were in black and white, and then they've been coloured in, and subsequent series were made in colour, and perhaps the Addams Family, with a budget for the second season, could have made it in colour if they wanted to, but it would have been a directorial decision to make it in black and white for the atmosphere, so that's interesting. And yes, they would have chosen whatever colours work best in the black and white. And what can I say about Ken Weatherwax as Pugsley? Originally, they were saying that the children were 6 and 8, but Pugsley, Ken Weatherwax, always seemed like he was a bit more than 8, so they changed their minds to say 6 and 10, not too far into the series. Charles Addams' notes said, chiefly what I remember anyway, is that Pugsley was destructive and would cobble together explosives and do a lot of blowing things up. And this is the other time I wanted to mention the new Addams Family series. They went back to that, and I know this from the opening title sequence that I saw with Thing in it. Pugsley is like blowing things up with dynamite and stuff. So I thought that was quite interesting because that aspect of the character really gets lost from Ken Weatherwax over to the movie where he's played by Jimmy Workman, who we'll talk about in a minute. Because Ken Weatherwax as Pugsley does that occasionally, very occasionally you'll hear some kind of explosion and they're like, oh, there's Pugsley with his dynamite. But it's really not a huge aspect of the character. I mean, he does kind of kid stuff, but in an Addams kind of way. Like, he goes through a worrying stage where his parents are like, oh my goodness, what's happening to him? He's growing up and he's gone all weird, and being weird is making friends with a puppy and wanting to join the Boy Scouts and that kind of thing. There's an episode where he befriends a chimpanzee. Oh, and then he gets like stuck behind this wall and Uncle Festus doing like a spell or something, and the chimpanzee's there with Pugsley's clothes on, and he thinks he's turned him into a chimpanzee, and that's rather a weak episode, I think. So they started off with, oh yes, Pugsley blows stuff up. He cuts the heads off Wednesday's dolls, which she likes. My brother Pugsley cut her head. But then they came up with different ideas for kind of kids stuff that he would do. In the movie, he's played, as I said, by Jimmy Workman, who does a fine job. Although he doesn't get that much to do, particularly in the second movie. But a fairly interesting story is that he was there, wherever you had to go, with his sister and their showbiz mum. And his sister was auditioning for the part of Wednesday, which she didn't get. And apparently someone saw Jimmy Workman and said, oh, we'll get him to play Pugsley. And it sounds to me, I don't wish to be rude, it does sound to me as if they were planning on writing an advert which said fat schoolboy required, like they did for Grange Hill, and they saw Jimmy Workman and decided that they didn't need to bother. It sounds like they didn't put that much effort into the casting or the characterization of Pugsley. And then when you watch him in the first movie, what idea about his character do you really get? He just kind of likes Addams stuff. He's getting electrocuted by Wednesday. He's falling asleep under the big thing that you take off and there's the dish, I don't know the name of that, at the party. He doesn't really do very much. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but what's interesting that they do include in the first movie, and I know is in at least one of those cartoon versions, is Pugsley nicks the stop sign to cause traffic to crash. Bravo, Pugsley! And isn't that based on an original Charles Addams drawing?
I don't remember, but it's extremely likely, and you've just reminded me that the Ken Weatherwax Pugsley has stop signs in his room, but we don't see him going and stealing them. So again, it's that stage further, making it darker, him bringing in the stop sign and hearing the crash. And of course, they probably assume that the cars all like crashing into each other. There's really no malice in them in the movie, though there may have been in Charles Addams' drawings. But then you get Addams Family Values, where he's really overshadowed by Christina Ricci as Wednesday. They give her all the jokes and the punchlines, except the one that we didn't get, the serial killer cards. Pugsley holds one up going, Amy Fisher. And we're like, who's that? And we had to look her up. So he's really kind of just support for Wednesday. They make him dress up as a turkey for the Thanksgiving pageant and all that kind of thing. And it's a shame in a way, because I think he's capable of more and they could have made better use of him.
Yeah, I think Christina Ricci is actually somewhat overused in Addams Family Values. I don't say she doesn't deserve to be given the chance to shine after her performance in the Addams Family first movie, because she does, but I do think they should have used Pugsley more than they did, and not given all the punchlines and the best bits that the two of them have to Wednesday. For instance, I think Pugsley should be allowed to deliver his own punchline when he shoots the American bald eagle with the summer camp bow and arrow. Aren't they extinct? One of the councillors says, and Wednesday is the one who says, well, now they are. But that should have been Pugsley allowed to deliver the punchline about his own practical piece of comedy on screen, I think.
Yes, I mean, it's true she is very good, but she does get to do everything.
We saw in the theatrical trailer on the DVD, didn't we, how Wednesday had done the whole line to this child who's telling the story about how her parents having a baby thanks to the stork, and then Wednesday comes in with our parents had sex. And then in the actual final cut of the film, they changed that into giving Pugsley the feed. Our parents are having a baby too. And Christina Ricci delivers, they had sex. So that's in some ways using Pugsley more, but again, it's just giving him the feed to go into Christina Ricci.
Yes, she does a couple of feed lines for her, like when they're asked, why do you hate the baby? We don't hate him, we just want to play with him, said Pugsley, and Wednesday goes, especially his head. Which isn't such a funny joke, actually, but it's another example of one of those. They're at this summer camp anyway, might as well mention this now, because Debbie, who you did mention, is getting rid of them so she can do what she wants to do. And we're going to tell you all about the plot when we get to the figure at the centre of the plot right at the end. But it's sending members of the family out into the world, isn't it? Expanding the world a bit that they created in the first movie. In a way, kind of subverting what they normally do, bringing people into the Addams world. It's sending Addamses out into the real world. But of course, I don't think anyone normal really wants to go to that ghastly a summer camp, do they? It's ridiculous, all the singing and stuff they have to do. And Wednesday, more than Pugsley, because she gets to do more really fancy, so gets involved with this character called Joel, who's being punished because he wouldn't make a birdhouse and all that kind of thing. And it's quite funny and well done. And one of the counsellors is played by Peter MacNicol, which is worth mentioning because we talked about him in Ghostbusters 2 and Bean, the Ultimate Disaster movie. And I was saying you could do worse than get together a Peter MacNicol collection of those three movies, Addams Family Values, Ghostbusters 2 and Bean, the Ultimate Disaster movie, all well worth watching.
He always adds so much to the humour of all of them, even if with quite a small part, like in Addams Family Values and even in Ghostbusters 2. It's not a huge part, it's an important one. And as well in Bean, where he's really very much a main character, the humour he does sustains that film very well too. He just adds a lot to whatever role he's playing in the film.
And with him as his wife / fellow counsellor is Christine
Baranski.
I can never remember her name, but I was at the time enjoying her very much in Sybil, if you've ever seen that. So quite interesting to see her, and she does a good job too. And we're doing Wednesday quite a different way round from the others, starting with the film, but that's because it came off Jimmy Workman. Christina Ricci was already establishing herself as a child actor. I know for sure that she'd been in Mermaids with Cher and Winona Ryder when she was very young, and probably some other things. And I'm sure Jimmy Workman's sister wouldn't have been nearly such a good Wednesday. In the TV series, she was played by Lisa Loring, who I mentioned as Showbiz Mum earlier. I really don't know anything about Jimmy Workman's mum, but Lisa Loring's mum sounds like the most Showbiz mum. She had Lisa an established modelling career by the time she auditioned for Wednesday, which she did when she was 5. And she and Ken Weatherwax are both on the episode commentaries, and Ken Weatherwax remembers a lot more about making the show than Lisa Loring does because he is quite a bit older, but he doesn't really seem to want to talk to Steve about it. And Lisa Loring, when she's asked questions, says, I can't remember. Gee, I can't remember. She was so little. But she does remember her first audition, where she was told that she had to pout, and she was told that she must never smile, which brings us back to Charles Addams' notes. Her name is Wednesday because she is full of woe, so she would just go around being miserable, which doesn't sound like a characteristic you can develop very much, and I don't think that was really the core of Wednesday's character in the TV series. Lisa Loring also remembers things like the lady who braided her hair. I mean, you would, wouldn't you? But she really doesn't remember anything about making the show.
Lisa Loring has the distinction of being the second of the three still living actors from the series at the time of this podcast, by the way.
And an interesting factoid is that she's the first Addams we see. In the first episode, a person is coming to inquire as to why the children aren't in school, and she answers the door. And she was a cute child, which helped her to get the part, and she said the lines perfectly well and gave a very endearing performance, I thought. And what does she do? She does things like run away and leave a note which says, "Dear Mother and Father, I hate you. Love, Wednesday," which used to make me laugh. And she has pet spiders. She gets a crush on this child called Robespierre, and they're all giving her things to help her impress him. And that reminds me, actually, Grandmama gives her what she calls love dust, I think. This kind of pouch of dust, which is a witchy thing, isn't it? So then Robespierre comes to play with Wednesday, and she chucks all this dust in his face, which is quite amusing, and the sort of thing that happens to you when you go to the Addams house that you're really not expecting and you rather hadn't happened. Yeah, she was told you must never smile, and whatever else she's got to do, play with this Robespierre person, have a governess come to teach her, run away, whatever she's doing, she does keep her melancholy face, or certainly her not smiling face usually, although I can see her smiling. I can't remember what she's doing at the time. Playing with Uncle Fester, perhaps. So sometimes she forgets not to smile, and she turns into, like Pugsley turns into a normal boy but an Addams, she turns into a normal girl but an Addams. Of course, you were mentioning Rocky the biker. He starts coming around to the Addams family, starting with the children, and they win his heart first. And they do a very memorable scene. They're both standing there going, "We know a secret, we know a secret," and it's that they're going to throw Rocky a surprise birthday party, which is the sort of thing his more conventional father has never done for him. And he starts being really touched. "Surprise party for me?" They do let it slip. But first of all, they say they can't tell him. That would be lying. And I hadn't seen very many episodes at that stage, and I thought, oh, well, they've got quite good morals then. They aren't bad people at all. But of course, a bit that used to make me laugh, Rocky's jokingly pretending he's going to guess their secret, and he says, "Satan's coming to dinner," and one of them, which one goes, "That was last week," which is quite funny. And then his father comes to the door, and he's asking have they seen him. And they've taken him in after he's crashed his motorcycle right outside. And he's asking, "Have you seen?" And he's describing him. And they won't say anything because that would be lying. He's wearing a leather jacket and all that kind of thing. And then he goes, "Riding a motorcycle?" And Pugsley's face lights up. He goes, "Riding a motorcycle?" And the dad said, "Yes." And they go, "No," and shut the door on him. And that used to make me laugh. So they do some really good scenes, particularly together, I think. And it's a shame when you hear that when they were getting tutored on set, they used to fight and hate each other, because they worked very well together as young actors. Wednesday's dolls with the heads cut off I mentioned, I think they're quite like Cousin It, something that you really associate with the Addams Family. Started off in the Charles Addams cartoons. I think there's one where the two of them are sitting with a guillotine, chopping the head off. She just goes around with these headless dolls. And then you do see Wednesday with one in the movie as well. And then thinking about Christina Ricci's performance, she certainly does never smile, and particularly in the first movie she does go around looking melancholy, being quite sort of monotonous, and then when they realise how good she was and start to overuse her, they take that the stage further by her having this really deadpan expression and saying all these really sinister things. Of course, one of the lines she delivers in the first movie that helped them to see that would be when she and Pugsley have their lemonade stand. And in fact, they have a lemonade stand at one stage in the TV series, so probably some inspiration there. And Mercedes McNabb, who's Harmony and Buffy, is wanting to know, is it made from real lemons, being all obnoxious. And then she's saying, I'll buy a cup if you buy a box of my delicious Girl Scout cookies. So, of course, Wednesday says, are they made from real Girl Scouts? And moments like that must have made them think, yeah, she's brilliant.
Which is why it's such a big deal when they get Wednesday to smile, or the camp counselors think they've gotten Wednesday to smile, they've broken her, and Christina Ricci does this whole big sequence of her face turning into a smile, and everyone going, oh. But of course, Wednesday's only tricking them, so she can ruin the pageant by staging an Indian rebellion.
Yes, by that stage she's very convincingly smiling and pretending to perform properly for the pageant, of course. And we mentioned Pugsley being a turkey in that, and she has this whole sequence and this whole speech where she's telling the pilgrims about how they're going to treat the Native American people like crap, and then they start burning down the set. And of course, the main antagonist at the camp is also played by Mercedes McNabb, Amanda, and there's really no reason why she shouldn't be the same character who was selling Girl Scout cookies before.
What I wanted to say about that pageant and Wednesday and the kind of retarded kids rebelling and ruining it and showing the privileged kids and the horrible fake cheery camp counselors who's boss is that the thing it's missing is there aren't any members of the Addams family apart from Wednesday and Pugsley there to witness it, which I think is a bit of a shame. In the first movie you've got Wednesday and Pugsley's play that Uncle Fester helps them with the blood effects and things, and everyone in the audience gets sprayed with fake blood and they hate it, and they get the standing ovation from their own family, bravo, bravo, and everyone else is absolutely horrified. And I think that's slightly missing from the second movie, the Thanksgiving pageant. There's no Addams is there to appreciate it. They're all busy in the bit of the movie that's kind of tailed off and gone a bit bad and doing something else at that time.
That is a fantastic scene with the play, isn't it? And it's off the back of these children dressed up as flowers and elves and stuff getting to know you, and of course the Addamses don't like that. But yes, those non-white, disabled, or even slightly less attractive children are all either excluded from the pageant or they're given what are seen as inferior roles, which hints at kind of racism, actually, doesn't it? All the blonde girls are playing the pilgrims who the white Americans will be descended from, and then they're making the ones they kind of don't like play the Native American Indian characters. And it's a terrible line. I only realised last time Joel is betrothed to Pocahontas in the play, and he's an Indian character, and his mother says however many $1,000 for summer camp, he's Mr. Woo-Woo, and I thought, oh my god, I only just realised I was so racist. But then that then fits in with the values and ideology I was talking about, and being yourself, and what is perceived to be right and normal not necessarily being the right thing. So that's quite clever, really, in a way. So I think that's everything to say about the children. So if we're getting there now, we've got Gomez, Morticia and Uncle Fester, who we're leaving for last. So let's talk about Gomez. We talked about him doing his lawyering in the TV series. And as well as Morticia's lighting candles with her finger, he's got sort of fire powers as well, in the sense that he can pick a cigar up out of his breast pocket, put it in his mouth and light it. And you find out, I mean, there was no other way to do it, was there? It was already lit, and he had this kind of fireproof lining in his pocket. Did John Astin, who played him brilliantly, and he also did the voice in the cartoons, didn't he?
Yes, he was the voice of Gomez in the 1970s and also the 1990s. It was interesting when that 1990s Addams Family cartoon was on the telly and the films were around. It's very obviously the voice of John Astin as Gomez in the new cartoon series as well. And as has been mentioned in our Warner Brothers podcast, John Astin was doing a lot of voice work, cartoon voice work around then in the 90s, including in Tasmania. And he is the third of the three actors who are still alive at the time of recording this podcast. He's 88 this year.
And it was quite interesting reading about Charles Addams' notes on Gomez and then comparing them to the cartoons, because he described him as and drew him as a subhuman. He's supposed to be the sort of missing link, and if you look at the original cartoons, he is a knuckle dragger. His hands are right on the ground, he's hunched over. And John Astin is not a subhuman, and he doesn't drag his knuckles. But once you know, you can see how his performance is not unlike Charles Addams' notes for this kind of subhuman aspect to the character. He's got this really wild look in his eyes. He's got quite a Neolithic kind of gait when he walks. He does swing his arms, even though he doesn't drag his knuckles, and it went completely over my head that that's what he was doing, although I noticed it was a good performance. But that is interesting when you read the notes. But then you get nothing of that, do you, with Raoul Julia in the movies. He wears a pinstripe suit and smokes a cigar like John Astin in a much more kind of upright, dapper kind of way. So a real evolution of the character in quite a Darwinian sense there. And what's interesting about Gomez, we think, is that you don't find him that funny when you're a child, because his humour is not very obvious. It's not so visual as a lot of the other characters, and the jokes verbally are a lot more subtle, and you watch it as a child and you enjoy it, and Gomez is okay. And then you come back to it as an adult and you're absolutely killing yourself laughing at his jokes. Some of them I got as a child, like in the movie, one of the people conning them is pretending to be a psychiatrist and talking about love and hate for your mother, and he goes, "I didn't hate my mother, it was an accident," which always used to make me laugh. And he doesn't elaborate on that because that's all you need. It's very funny. You can imagine what might have happened. And things like that joke we were talking about earlier, no matter what the verdict, I would appeal. You suddenly realise as an adult, that's really funny, actually.
I remember learning from film 94, I think, that Raoul Julia had died, become ill and died quite soon after making Addams Family Values. And I thought, that's a shame. In itself, it's a shame, of course, and for his friends and family. But they'll never be able to get that Addams Family cast together again and make a third movie, and I think that would have been nice to have the option. So that was a sad bit of premature death news there, and I certainly think it added a lot to the two Addams Family movies in the early 90s there, in the last few years of his life.
Yes, he really was excellent. It's an excellent cast all round, although for some reason they weren't very keen on Judith. I don't think I want to say anything else about Gomez on his own, perhaps with Morticia, so we'll talk about her. I don't remember anything about Charles Addams' notes on Morticia, but perhaps that's just because it is very obvious what she's supposed to be. A kind of dark, temptress, beautiful woman kind of thing, with a macabre version of a sexy dress and that kind of thing, and she sort of glides around, kind of vampiric in a way. And he always drew her with a very pale face. He drew everything in black and white, but he would kind of shade bits, and she would always have very dark hair and dress and stand out white face. So even if she wasn't actually undead, she was intended to evoke those kinds of ideas.
It's that stage before the monsters that the monsters actually had to step over in order to make it funny.
And they were telling me on the DVD that they had real trouble casting Morticia. And somebody at some stage said, I think Carolyn Jones should do it, and they didn't think they would get Carolyn Jones because she was a movie star and might think she was too good for a sitcom. But fortunately, they got her to come and be Morticia, and that's why she's first in the two names, Carolyn Jones, John Astin, even though she's not first alphabetically in the opening music.
Yes, and John Astin had been on board from the start, hadn't he, helping to adapt the characters, I seem to remember reading.
That's right.
He was really part of the show from its inception, and as has been mentioned, he always came back and voiced Gomez in the cartoons. Has been a huge part of the Addams Family.
But very important was that he and Morticia, Carolyn Jones, should have chemistry, and they did, didn't they? They were fantastic together, and they did a lot of scenes together. And they were very, very much in love with each other, and enamoured with each other. And one of the things that, if anyone knows anything about the Addams Family, is that she would say things like, mon cher and oui and that kind of thing, and he would go absolutely mad. Tish, that's French, and start kissing her all up her arm, which is another one of those things they did just briefly in the film. Much more understated. That's French. Oui. And then he just starts kissing her hand and nothing else really comes of it. Another thing, just for fans of the show watching the film, was of course Morticia cutting the heads off the roses. She was doing that constantly in the TV series because they think roses look nicer with no heads on. And there's a scene once where, I don't know, I think they're expecting someone, and Morticia's going, oh no, look, the heads have grown back on these roses, why do they keep doing that? There's no time to trim them now. And then she goes, I know, and turns them upside down and shoves the heads into the vase, which is a bit different for that very familiar scene of her trimming her roses. And she has a lot of hobbies, like kind of 60s housewife did, I suppose. Knitting, sewing, cutting out paper dolls. There are whole episodes about her taking up art, sculpture, writing, all that kind of thing. And I very much associate her with her greenhouse, particularly Cleopatra, the African Strangler. And that's a prop, a puppet, in fact. And when you get the DVD and watch it on the modern tellies, you can see the string, but I never saw that when I was younger. And it's this carnivorous plant, and she's always feeding it bits of meat, and sometimes Lurch does it. She strokes it and makes kissing noises at it, and is very fond of it and thinks of it as a pet. And it's one of the things that freak people out. They come in and this plant starts strangling them, and Morticia's saying, now, Cleopatra, she likes you, and that kind of thing, like you would with an overexcited dog. And they paid a bit of homage to Cleopatra in the first film, didn't they, where the character I mentioned pretending to be a psychiatrist is coming and snooping, and this plant just wraps her up in itself and doesn't eat her, as Cleopatra might like to do, but does kind of winding, twisty plant stuff like Cleopatra. So that's good to have homage to all these things. And Morticia did used to make me laugh as a child. And the same thing in the films, where she's played by Angelica Houston. She's brilliant, isn't she?
Yes, indeed.
Like I was talking about the demonic possession of Pubert, and she's reading him The Cat in the Hat, and obviously thinking it's not a suitable book for children at all. It's certainly not suitable for an Addams child. And what's the line that you like?
She says to him, are you enjoying this? Like, how could anybody possibly enjoy it? And then seeing if it's going to get any better, she flips to the end and makes this disappointed face and says, oh no, he lives. I mean, as if you would expect from reading The Cat in the Hat that he's going to die at the end. But that would have been the only thing that could save the book, in Morticia's opinion.
Yes, showing how they really don't get the kinds of things that most people do and perhaps like. And she has loads of great one-liners, doesn't she? Fester's unpacking, which there's more to it than might seem from what I'm about to say, but she's unpacking all his weapons and stuff. And cyanide, Fester, as if we'd run out. And that kind of thing. Her relationship with Gomez is still very close and physical and loving. It's much less kind of outlandish and comedic than it is in the sitcom. A bit that I always loved Carolyn Jones doing was in that insurance one, where they have burnt to ashes their stuffed bear with a flamethrower. And as Digby, the assistant to Mr. Henson, says, there isn't an insurance policy in the world that would cover a flamethrower. And lots of bits of that episode I like, especially now that I'm older. Henson's telling Digby that he mustn't give the Addamses any money, and he's saying there are two sides to this business, taking the money in and refusing to pay it out. And that is so true, isn't it? That is insurance so much. Digby's trying to find reasons, before he's got to the flamethrower, not to give them their insurance settlement. And he's looking at this pile of ashes and saying, how do I know this was a bear? And when I was little, I really didn't understand why he was asking that, what that had to do with insurance, but I get it now. You know, he's looking for reasons to say that they don't have a claim. There's this quite long sequence, and it just keeps kind of cutting away to the next bit, and Morticia's saying, does it look like an antelope? No. A giraffe? No. And yeah, I can't remember exactly what they were. All of them, because there's loads, and it keeps cutting, and Digby's looking more and more distressed and sweating and opening up his collar and going, no, and she's just listing all these animals perfectly calmly. And I think it's a camel when he goes, well, and then she looks at him and gives him this really evil look and he goes, no. So sort of quite scaring him into submission there, her vampiric face. But when you're a child, you get that, don't you? You get why it's funny. And it's also quite funny that he thinks it might kind of look like a camel. It really doesn't look any more like a camel than any of those other things. And then the punchline, of course, she's gone through all the animals. And the punchline is, well then, it must be a bear. Doesn't ask him, does it look like a bear? But that kind of humour I got when I was a child. They gave that to Morticia, and it's the same sort of thing. In the films, you get those jokes that Angelica Houston does so well. They're looking for stuff for this charity auction that I was talking about, and she's picking things out of this wardrobe, and I think anyone can see it coming, but the delivery is very funny. Uncle Knick-Knack's winter wardrobe, Uncle Knick-Knack's summer wardrobe, Uncle Knick-Knack, and then they just dump this body on the floor, which is in like a bag. A lot of their dead are buried out in the graveyard. They've got one in the wardrobe. They think nothing of it. It's just funny because it's funny. And finally, Uncle Fester, who's the last character. And I've left him to last because he's very, very interesting and very, very important. And Charles Addams drew him as a kind of hunchback lurker sort of character, and all those adults are a kind of something, aren't they? Lurch is a kind of Frankenstein's monster, Grandma's a kind of witch, Gomez a kind of subhuman, Morticia a kind of vampire. The children aren't really a kind of anything, aren't they? But yes, Uncle Fester a kind of lurking, sinister, hiding in the shadows, freak you out sort of a person. And he was played in the 60s by Jackie Coogan, and they were telling me that he was very well known as Boy in a film with Charlie Chaplin, and they were calling him the first child star and all that kind of thing. And I watched that film with Charlie Chaplin, and it was actually very good and very interesting. Silent song. And they really go with that kind of sinister lurker thing, even in that opening sequence with the clicking, where he is lurking behind Morticia's chair, a very famous chair that you can visualise her sitting in if you know anything about the Addams Family. And he has this kind of sinister look, and they probably filmed that before anything else, and they really didn't know where they were going to go with the character. And there are episodes in the first series that he isn't in, like Grandmama, and they make frequent references to what he might be doing, hanging upside down in the belfry and that kind of thing, and doing the kinds of things that Charles Addams would have drawn him doing. But then Jackie Coogan really brought something incredibly special to the character. He was just so funny, and everyone will say that he was very, very funny, but I'm not just jumping on the bandwagon. I agree with him. He was excellent. And the more they realised this, the more they gave Uncle Fester things to do, and he's in every episode of season 2, and that really is the very definition of a breakout character.
His name is added to the opening sequence, so they were giving him more money.
And rightly so, although I don't know, if you sit and watch it through thinking about it, you might say, like Christina Ricci, he's overused. He's the one who burns down the stuffed bear with the flamethrower. And might as well mention, while I remember, there's a stuffed bear amongst all their junk in the Uncle Knick-Knack attic area in the film, again, for those of us who remember the TV series. But all sorts of things happen. He's trying to impress this woman and putting on wigs because he's worried about being bald. There's a doctor coming to see him, and that's a very funny sequence. He wants to examine Uncle Fester. He's saying, stick out your tongue and say ah, and he just goes just very briefly, and it's better if you can see him doing it, but you can imagine, I hope. And he wants him to take off his coat, and Uncle Fester's clutching his great big coat to him, going, no, I never take my coat off, never. He did a funny voice like that, and he won't take one arm out of his coat for the blood pressure. No, he says. And it's really not a lot like what Charles Addams was drawing and envisioning, is it? It's the kind of comedy that Jackie Coogan can do, and they really used it a lot. And before I talk about him in the movies, I will mention, as promised, why we thought Granny Frump had to be his sister. It's confirmed in the marriage episode that he is Morticia's uncle. Up to then, he refers to Gomez and Morticia as my niece and nephew. So one of them is married into his family. family as he sees it. I suspect Charles Addams kind of thought he was Gomez's uncle because, the Addams family. But they decided he'd be Morticia's, so they kind of swap Grandmama and Fester, who they belong to. And at one stage, he doesn't know what his surname is. Now, if he was Morticia's father's brother, it would be Frump, wouldn't it? So that must mean he's Morticia's mother's brother, and that's quite nice because he comes to see Morticia, Ophelia, and Granny Frump as Uncle Fester, and he's related by blood to all of them, and Ophelia greets him as Uncle Fester, quite rightly. Then when she's in it again, she's played by Carolyn Jones as well, by the way, I didn't mention, but when she's in it again, they sort of seem to forget that Fester is her blood uncle, and there's this scene where she's stroking his bald head in a rather sexual way and all that kind of thing. But anyway, because of Jackie Coogan's performance and Fester being a breakout character, and I'm sure this is right, it's because of this, it was decided that Fester would be a very major character in the movies, played by a very famous actor known for being eccentric and funny, Christopher Lloyd.
Wonderful Christopher Lloyd, who we praise so much in the Back to the Future podcast. And yes, he very much did the Addams Family directly after Back to the Future. Perhaps being eccentric, funny Doc was a big plus for helping to think that he's the right person to be Fester.
It certainly worked on me. I'd been watching the TV series, and then I heard Christopher Lloyd, who I knew perfectly well was Doc, as Uncle Fester. I thought, yeah, that sounds brilliant, and I couldn't wait to see it. So, if it worked on me, it probably worked on other people too, and it worked not just as a box office draw, but I think it worked artistically as well. Christopher Lloyd is very, very good. And the plot of the first film, I keep talking about these people trying to con them. What's happened there is that they've decided Uncle Fester would be the children's uncle, Gomez's brother and his older brother, therefore entitled to the Addams estate. And I didn't used to like that much. I used to think that was changing it too much. Uncle Fester's supposed to be an uncle of the previous generation, and I don't know why it bothered me quite that much. I think it's alright, really.
He doesn't meet anyone he's the uncle of until somewhere into the Addams Family movie. And he ends up as the uncle of 3 people. So that's perfectly good to be an uncle.
Yeah, so he gets more and more each time, really. For Charles Addams, he's one person's uncle. In the 60s, he's 2 people's uncle, and then he gets 3. That's rather tidy. Uncle Fester went missing before he was ever an uncle, and this person pretending to be a psychiatrist has, as she says, this son called Gordon, who the lawyer that they've been loan sharking money to says looks like Fester, who's been missing. So they dress Gordon up as Fester, and the only thing that really bothers me is that they have to shave his head, whereas Fester, I'm sure, is naturally bald. So Gordon, who turns out to be the real Fester, shouldn't have to shave his head. It doesn't make sense. And I always thought, even when I was little, he kind of has to turn out to be the real Uncle Fester, doesn't he? Otherwise there's no Uncle Fester in this film. But there are hints, really, from when we first meet him, that he is the real Fester. The way that he is wanting to do horrible things to the lawyer character. I can't remember his name, I'm sorry.
Tully Alford.
That's right. And he's like picking him up and holding him against the wall, turning him upside down. He seems to have this superhuman strength. So it's obvious that Gordon is no ordinary guy. Then he goes back to the Addams house. He's initially freaked out by everything. He's trying to find things out and con them and pretend to be Fester. They're watching this old cine film, aren't they? And Fester and Gomez are teenagers at this party, and Fester goes, "Your first cigar," having a bit of a guess there. And then a line I like, "Fester, I've smoked since I was 5. Mother insisted." That's a very funny one-liner. And of course, there's a safe, isn't there? 2, 10, and then Fester's going, 5, having a guess, but it's 11. 2, 10, 11. Eyes, fingers, toes. We used to like that when we were little. And then he starts bonding with the children, helping them with their play, as you were discussing, and realising that he is the real Fester.
Yes. He's about to sneak off and try and look for the vault, and he sees the children doing their fight scene, and he can't stop himself rushing over and helping them do it with fake blood and fake body parts and things. No, 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 children, this will look much better. So that's the real Fester coming out. As he says, being in my old room sure brings back memories, and he's just trying to use it as part of his cover. But actually, it's true, and it is bringing out the real Fester all the time.
And then his mother character is kind of manipulating him into always coming back to her, so that's why it takes a while for him to realise whose side he's really on. Then things happen, the rest of the family get kicked out of the house and have to go and live in this motel and all sorts of things, but really nothing else that needs explaining. And then in the second film, Addams Family Values, Fester is quite happy that he's the real Fester and back settled with the family. A bit I always used to like was when in the "Why do you hate the baby" scene he's talking about sibling rivalry. And Gomez is talking about the things they used to do to each other, and Fester says, when he was asleep, I opened up his skull and removed his brains.
You did?
That's brilliant. It's funny, and you might not like it if you only like jokes that make sense. If that's true and Gomez has no brains, how is he alive? But, you know, it's just Addams humour, isn't it?
Addams Family Values opens with Christopher Lloyd as Uncle Fester howling to the moon like a werewolf. And you say that's something inspired by Charles Addams.
Yes, I forgot. I don't know if he did it in a cartoon, but it's certainly something he might have done.
And they briefly reference the plot of the first movie by saying Fester's spent many years abroad. But that's all you kind of get, all the reference you kind of get to it in the second movie. So nothing will be spoiled when you watch the first movie. If you've already watched the second, you won't immediately get what's going on.
Which brings us to the main plot, because the character that's being told that is Debbie, isn't it? Played by Joan Cusack, who we've mentioned a couple of times, and herself becomes an Addams. And they don't want us to be wondering about this for very long. She's established as the new nanny for mainly Pubert, but also Pugsley and Wednesday. And then very soon after she's introduced, we learn that she is the Black Widow who marries rich men and then kills them and takes all the money. And I guess that's okay that we know what she's up to for most of the time, practically all of the time. I think if we didn't know that, we would be a bit disappointed to see her forming a relationship with Fester, for him then to be heartbroken and stabbed in the back. So maybe that was the thinking behind revealing it so early on. And when Fester first meets Debbie, he's hiding, lurking behind the stairs and peeping out, which again is very much the sort of thing Charles Addams envisaged. So I suppose it's sort of quite easy to stick with that aspect of the character, especially with the wonderful eccentric performance of Christopher Lloyd. He can do that kind of thing, whereas it's harder to maintain the kind of subhuman aspect of Gomez, for instance.
And what wonderful deliveries Christopher Lloyd does do as part of that storyline. Gomez saying all suavely at the restaurant how beautiful and radiant Debbie and Morticia are, and they're the luckiest brothers in the universe and things. Nudging Fester, go on, you join in. Christopher Lloyd comes out with, that's right, we should have ugly girls. Absolutely brilliant.
It's very funny. He's not saying anything different from what Gomez is saying in terms of what he means, but it's the way he says it, isn't it?
And what else does he say so brilliantly? What's in his surprise present from Debbie? Is it string? So funny. And it's a bomb. What?
Of course he would like a bomb, wouldn't he?
Yes.
Which she doesn't quite seem to have grasped. And of course the bit that used to make me kill myself laughing, and I still chuckle at it now, is when she's saying, I'm a virgin.
You are?
Yes.
What's that?
That's brilliant.
Absolutely excellent.
Oh, he's very good.
I do think he channels a bit of his recent performance as Doc at times, when he's saying flora and fauna. It always reminds me of Jules and Ver. And there's a couple of eccentric bits where he's explaining something or saying something very quickly that reminds me of Doc. I think you wouldn't necessarily think of it off the top of your head, but I think being Doc is a good warm-up to interpreting Fester.
Yes, perhaps that had something to do with the timing of actually getting these movies made. Worked out very well anyway. But then, of course, we come back to this idea of invulnerability. Debbie tries to kill him on the wedding night by dropping the stereo in his bath. The light bulbs explode and everything, and all the lights go out, and there's all this sparks, electricity and stuff, and she thinks she's killed him, but no, of course she hasn't. And he relights one of the bulbs with a close-up of it falling into the bath by putting it in his mouth, which he also did at the end of the first film, and that's homage to the TV series where Jackie Coogan used to do that.
And you could say that he's invulnerable to that because he has electrical powers. But then with the next bit of attempting to kill him, where she blows up the house, that still doesn't work, and you can't really say that that was his electrical powers protecting him there. He just has this level of invulnerability like the Addams do.
Yes, and I forgot to say in that doctor scene, he eats the thermometer, and of course in those days it would have been a mercury thermometer, not a digital thermometer like we tend to have now, and the doctor's absolutely freaking out. Oh my god, we have to get him to hospital, he's just eaten however many milligrams of mercury, but he's fine. And in the first film, I was saying, wasn't I, Wednesday electrocutes Pugsley. But then things happen like when they're dropping the baby off the roof and Gomez catches him and it's like, oh look, the baby nearly died, but he'd probably have been alright, wouldn't he, being an Addams? And then the denouement of that film, Addams Family Values, is Debbie about to kill all of them in 8 electric chairs, because Thing's in one, isn't he?
Yes.
And it's like, you're supposed to be thinking, oh no, the Addamses are all about to die, until Hubert comes along and diverts the current back to Debbie, but it doesn't really work in that way because it wouldn't kill them.
Yes, I always think Addams Family Values does tail off a bit. You asked me quite recently if I thought it was better than the first movie, and I think, well, perhaps it is in a lot of ways, but I do think it suffers more than the first movie with its ending. It kind of gets a bit lost and going around in circles, and then has this denouement that doesn't quite work.
Yes, higher peaks and lower troughs, I think it has.
Yeah.
One more thing I'd like to say is that Debbie does end up in the graveyard, the Addams graveyard, Debbie Jelinski Addams, and she's the kind of person that they like to talk about, and they speak with pride of serial killers, and oh yeah, she married Fester Addams, and she tried to kill him, and she died in the process. It's just the sort of story they would love to tell, so probably they're quite pleased with how that marriage turned out.
Ensnared Fester in your sexual web, have him under some strange spell. I respect that, says Morticia, that sort of thing.
Yeah, again, the kind of line that Angelica Houston's brilliant at. And then the end of the movie is Fester making a connection with baby What's nanny, dementia, means insanity. And you get the feeling that maybe they're going to have a more long-term relationship than you did with Debbie.
My name's Fester. It means to rot. We used to quite enjoy that. Chris Lloyd delivering that as well.
And that's everyone in the Addams Family talked about in their various incarnations.
Join us again next time for a podcast on Red Dwarf, another BBC sitcom. Is going to be in the spotlight, and again, it may take a little while to talk about, but it should be very fascinating stuff. So do join us again for that on the final Sunday in August. Until then,
good night out there.
whatever you are.